Alrighty, let us pick up right where we left off with section 13 of When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. So we got through section 12 last time. There was a graded journal entry. And so section 13, despite it feeling like it's kind of near the end because there are 16 sections, we're really just about halfway through. I think somewhere in here, probably right about here, I think there are 205, 206 lines to the poem, something like that. And so it's really actually in section 13 that we're halfway through. And like I mentioned before, this is actually composed with a scheme or a plan very much in mind. It's as opposed to maybe even Song of Myself, which can be so expansive that you lose track of yourself in there. This is sort of this regulated plan, almost like a plot that he's developing. So I'm going to point us back to section 9 here, just to remind us like what it was that it felt like the thrush was doing, because that's the one element of the trinity or the trifecta that is sort of hard to understand, and then it's going to take over the second half of the poem. So section 9, what I just mentioned was that there was this tension in section 8 and section 9 between the star calling to him and detaining him and him feeling this overwhelming grief, and then the thrush singing to him and calling to him in section 9. And then the same thing happens in section 13. The bird calls to him and he's going to go with the bird. So, sing on, you gray-brown birds, sing from the swamps, the recesses, pour your chant from the bushes, limitless, out of the dusk, out of the cedars and pines. And so what you'll notice here, and again, there's this tension, you only I hear, yet the star holds me, but soon will depart. So, notice in this description here at the beginning of section 13 and then in section 14 as well, that the thrush is associated with the swamp, and he says, I'm going to go down to see you, where it's dark and the cedars and the pines and it's quiet there, and there's a sort of a descent going on there. So now section 14 and 15 are the two longest and most important sections of the poem. And so before we go any further, let's take one quick moment to just kind of recap the last couple sections. So these are things that we already went over, and this slide isn't new except for the end there, section 13. So again, we don't know exactly what's going on with the bird, why it's calling to him, so we're going to see that in just a moment. Now, before we do, what I'm going to explain is that in this video, what I'm doing is I'm going to use an archetypal lens to look at the last half of the poem. So we've talked before when we were reading Harriet Jacobs, we talked about feminist literary theory, and I just mentioned, that it's a lens through which to view art and literature. Talked about that for, I think, half a class period. Feminist literary theory. And so a lot of these different theories, archetypal, feminist, Marxist, postmodern, they're just different ways to sort of think about literature in general and art. And this one happens to be very applicable to Whitman's poem. So, archetypal literary theory. Basically the use of Carl Jung's ideas about archetypes, about folklore, about mythology. And just really quickly, besides the definition that we have there, so Jung and other people that came after him, Marie-Louise von Franz, basically looked at a couple of different things. Often sacred literature, for example, Hebrew scriptures, the Christian Gospels, but also sometimes folklore, sometimes mythology, and analyzed them. And an easy, simple way to think about archetypal literary theory are archetypes could be recurring character types within literature and mythology, or they could be recurring plot elements. And the most common way that most people understand or have heard of archetypal literary theory is through the Joseph Campbell book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Basically, just the idea that there's sort of a hero's quest, and there's some value in that. I'm not going to go into that anymore. Just it's basically for us, we want to think about archetypal literary theory as a way to think about a plot element that's going to come up in just a few moments. So, great. Let's go back to the poem and look at section 14. So, now you'll remember that in section 12, he seemed to be really praising America. He was actually happy in section 12. It's like as he was praising America and thinking of doing so for Whitman, he sort of dispelled his unhappiness that he'd felt earlier in the poem. Now the bird calls to him, and then here's this big shift that comes in section 14. So, and it's just actually rather prosaic in a way here, or expository. Well, I sat forth in the day and looked forth in the close of the day with its light in the fields of spring and the farmers preparing their crops. So it's late afternoon, it's, twilight. And then this is a really important line, which we're going to come back to and kind of unpack. This fourth line here. In the large, unconscious scenery of my land, with its lakes and forests, and the heavenly aerial beauty under the arching heavens of the afternoon, the many moving sea tides, etc. So he says, in the large, unconscious scenery of my land. Now, the bird is calling to him, and then something, this, I guess, recollection of sadness comes back to him, this thought of death. And he says, appeared the cloud, appeared the long black trail, and I knew death, its thought, and the sacred knowledge of death. Now, what's going to happen is basically we're going on this, or Whitman's speaker is going on this kind of descent or this journey, and he says, with the knowledge of death as walking one side of me, and the thought of death close walking the other side of me, and I in the middle as with companions, and as holding the hands of companions, I have fled forth to the hiding receiving night that talks not, down to the shores of the water, the path by the swamp in the dimness. So again, I mentioned that what we want to notice especially here is it's like he's going on this journey, this descent. He says he's going down into the darkness. And this corresponds with this line 3, the large unconscious scenery of my land. So it's as if the bird is calling him into this sort of different state, this journey into the darkness. The singer, so shy to the rest, received me. The gray-brown bird I know received us comrades 3, and he sang the carol of death and a verse for him I love. From deep secluded recesses, from the fragrant cedars and the ghostly pines so still, came the carol of the bird, and it wrapped me, as I held as if by their hands my comrades in the night, and the voice of my spirit tallied the song of the bird. Now, section 14 is, if you have your book in front of you, not only obviously the longest section of the poem, but you'll notice that there's this italicized section in the middle of 14, beginning with come lovely and soothing death, and it goes all the way until the end of 14. It's all italicized. Now, just so we're clear, it's really simple. He's been brought down somewhere, and then the bird is singing this thing to him, and so it's italicized because it's the bird's song. So this is the beginning of the bird's song, and it goes throughout the end of section 14. And I want you to notice that Whitman does this kind of interesting thing here. The first line of section 15 has the word tally, and also the last line before the italic starts, he uses tallied as a verb, and the voice of my spirit tallied the song of the bird. So it's really cool. The line preceding the bird's song, when he uses tally, he uses it as a verb, and when it's used as a verb, tallied means to cause to correspond with. So the voice of my spirit tallied the song of the bird. So it's like the bird's song kind of merges and shifts Whitman's speaker's own mental state and causes it to correspond with it. Great. Well, what does the bird say? It's a theme that we saw basically in Song of Myself that's about death, although it's going to be put in a more sort of lush and different manner here. But obviously death is never going to be a bad thing for Whitman's poetry. Come, lovely and soothing death, undulate round the world, serenely arriving in the day and the night to all, to each, sooner or later, delicate death. So you'll notice what he does here with death is all of the normal things that we would associate it with, that it's scary, that it's the Grim Reaper, that it's the end. He's going to do basically the opposite. It's soft, it's delicate. He calls it, mother. Remember toward the end of Song of Myself, he said, "You don't frighten me, death. You're an accoucheur, a midwife." And so this is a very similar thing too. Praised be the fathomless universe for life and joy, for objects and knowledge, and for love, sweet love, for the sure and winding, but also for the sure and winding arms of cool and folding death. So it's like here, these are the things that normally get praised. Love, the beauty of the world, life and joy, but also he's saying, let's sing a song for death. And then, so unusual the way this next line, dark mother always gliding near with soft feet. Have none chanted for thee a chant of fullest welcome? Then I chant it for thee. I glorify thee above all. I bring thee a song that when thou must indeed come unfalteringly. Strong deliver us. Again, reminds us of accoucheur from Song of Myself. When it is so, when thou hast taken them, I joyously sing the dead, lost in the loving, floating ocean of thee, laved in the flood of thy bliss, O death. From me to thee, glad serenades, dances for thee. So, again, all of this praise for death. I float this carol with joy to thee, O death. Now, and then in section 15, again, that to the tally of my soul. So just kind of notice that what he did there was he used that same word in two different ways. In the line before the bird song, he said, the bird song caused a correspondence with my own mental state. And then to the tally of my soul. Tally here is a noun, could mean a reckoning or an instruction. So it's like the bird has caused an instruction, which we're going to get to in just a moment. So before we do, we're going to go back for just a moment into section 3. So in the into line 3 of section 14, the large unconscious scenery of my land. So I want to talk just a little bit about what happens here in section 4. Why is this bird singing to him? What does that all mean? So I really want to unpack this one line here. The large unconscious scenery of my land. All right, so what we've got here, it's section 14, line 10. And he says, the unconscious scenery. So what I've got here on this slide is just simply that unconscious maybe provides a way, several ways, for us to look at this liminal just meaning like a transitional state. And so what we're going to do is just kind of look at 4 different ways that we can view what's gone on here, this descent, this calling of the bird into his unconscious. And so the next 4 slides are just going to be different ways that all sort of work together, but there are different ways to explain this transition into the unconscious. So here we go. So we're just looking at 4 different ways of sort of unpacking this third line of section 14. And the first would be in the large unconscious scenery of my land. So we can look at this as a descent into the underworld. So this is, as it says there, an archetypal plot element. So a descent into the underworld is just something that's was written about often in Greek mythology and Roman mythology. And then from a Jungian or from an archetypal literature perspective, we can think of a descent into the underworld as kind of a plot element. So the most well-known. So this is a painting by, I think, Frederick Leighton, and this is the Return of Persephone's. So the woman here, toward the bottom right of the painting, that's Persephone, who's coming up out of the underworld. Coming up out of the underworld, I think helped probably by that would be Hermes, who's often like the guide of the souls or the messenger of the gods. And she's coming up to her mother, Demeter, the goddess of harvest and agriculture. And the reason I think this is it's a beautiful painting for one thing. And it's sort of a good way of just understanding this idea. Well, she's not descending into the underworld. She has been in the underworld, been in Hades with her husband, the god of the underworld. And she's coming back to her mother, Demeter. And so this was a really important central myth in Greek mythology, and it came to be understood much later as maybe a way of understanding the cycle of the seasons. And so it's also kind of cool to think about this in April, because right now, what are we doing? What's going on with the natural world? Well, it's spring. We're coming out of winter, and this painting here is a sort of depiction of that in archetypal terms. She's coming back up to above ground, to her mother, and the idea being that it's just some kind of a representation maybe of the cycle of fertility. So great. So anyway, that's one way to kind of think about this, is that the section 14, what happens is that the speaker of the poem goes into some sort of descent into the underworld. So, there we go. Another similar way to think about this, without a beautiful painting, would just be that what happens in the beginning of section 14 is it's some kind of an existential crisis that the speaker is going through. It's a loss of ego. And if we think about ego just being associated with our conscious mind, the things that we think about on a daily basis, our identity, for college students, what's your major? What Greek house are you in? What year in school are you? Where are you from? Oh, you're from Atlanta, you're from Houston, blah, blah, blah. We talked about some of those things at the beginning of Song of Myself in regards to the labels. And Whitman said, trippers and askers surround me. The name of where I come from, blah, blah, blah. And so we can think about movement into the unconscious as also being a loss of ego, perhaps catalyzed by some sort of existential crisis, by some kind of suffering. So that's a possibility for what's going on here. Is it's the crisis in the poem is for the speaker being sad about the assassination of Lincoln, but also, as we remember from the first third of the poem, he shifted the emphasis from Lincoln to a communal loss when he said, lilacs to coffins, plural, all I bring. So maybe it's this, there's been this sort of existential crisis, this moment of great suffering in the speaker and in the reader of the poem for everybody. The Civil War killed 600,000 Americans, more than, I think I'm right when I say this, more than all other U.S. wars since then combined. So it's this moment of pain and loss on a sort of communal large scale. So, descent into the underworld, loss of ego. That brings up a third sort of way of looking at this. And I'm going to collect, there's going to be a slide which has all four of these things together. So this would be another similar way of viewing what's going on here. In unpacking this important third line of section 14, the large unconscious scenery of my land. So this is a portrait of the Catholic mystic from the 16th century, St. John of the Cross. He's got this really beautiful poem, Dark Night of the Soul. And actually, Dark Night of the Soul feels very much like what's going on in section 14 and in the poem kind of in general. I'm just going to read you a couple of lines from Dark Night of the Soul, the 16th century poem by St. John of the Cross, the Spanish mystic and now a Roman Catholic saint. On a dark night kindled in love with yearnings, oh, happy chance, I went forth without being observed, my house being now at rest, in darkness and secure by the secret ladder, disguised in darkness and in concealment in the happy night when no one saw me. And so I don't want to go on too long about Dark Night of the Soul, but the poem is about, as you can guess, it's about a union with God, and it's about, going through. There's lots of different ways to interpret it theologically, but the most common interpretation is that it's central to being a Christian that you suffer in some way as you come to know God. So that would be the simplest theological explanation for it. It's a really beautiful poem. And and the language here is, kind of similar. And the idea, obviously Whitman's poem is not a Christian poem, but I would say the two poems are kind of parallel to each other because they're both about suffering having some value, and then there being a sort of spiritual epiphany. For St. John of the Cross, it's obviously an epiphany about God, about Christian God. So, alrighty, fourth and last way to sort of think about the poem and what's going on in section 14 is we can think of it as the value of self-questioning. So here's what I mean by that. If you'll notice, in section 11, 8, the star detains him. This is his grief over Lincoln, or for the reader of the poem, the grief over feeling your loss of your husband or your father or your brother or whoever it might have been, one of the soldiers in the Civil War. All of this grief in section 8. Birds calling you in section 9. And then in section 10, he asks these questions. How do I commemorate this person that I loved? What do I do for this person? He asks those questions again in section 11. So all I'm suggesting here with this slide, the value of self-questioning, and we'll put all four of these together now. So that fourth one, the value of self-questioning, is just maybe that it's a way to think about all three of them, actually. What do I mean by the value of self-questioning? Well, Whitman's speaker asks himself in the poem, how do I commemorate thee? And he starts thinking, and it's this sort of interesting process. He starts thinking about America that he loves, that Lincoln loved. And so basically what all four of these things together is they just provide a sort of framework for thinking about what's going on there at the beginning of section 14. It could be a descent into the underworld. It could be a loss of the egoic state. It's a dark night of the soul. As far as that's a metaphor about suffering having some kind of a redeeming value, that it brings you suffering can bring you some kind of a spiritual lesson or an improvement in your life. And that's not just something that comes from Dark Night of the Soul. I would say that sort of looking at religions, plural, probably all of them, that all of them have, if there are a couple of things that are frequently found, there's always lessons about humility, but there are also always lessons about suffering. And if you think about in Christian iconography, what is the single most, well represented, the one symbol of Christianity? It's the cross, it's the suffering. But even in Eastern religions, if you think about things like karma, so there's always this idea that suffering is going to have some kind of a lesson that we can learn from it. So, all right, great. And so the value of self-questioning might just be that when we are suffering, when we start asking questions, maybe actually as a way out of our suffering, we get some sort of knowledge about things. So hopefully that didn't confuse you. Those are just different the beginning of section 14 and what goes on with the bird's song is such a interesting, weird, mystical thing that it takes a lot of unpacking to think about, what's going on here. So these are just 4 ways to think about them. Now, so all of those things that we just looked at there, descent into the underworld, loss of ego, dark night of the soul, the value of questioning those things, all of those things can be thought of in Jungian terms of its descent into the collective unconscious. So, great. Let's go back to the poem first of all and look at what happens within the poem, because we haven't even gotten to the climax yet. So, alrighty. So, again, the italicized thing is all the bird's song. The bird sings this. It's not just the bird singing it. It's the bird singing it and causing some sort of correspondence in the speaker of the poem's own mental and emotional understanding. And then this leads to section 15 is, as you saw in the last slide, this revelation. So, and section 15 is the climax of the poem. Absolutely. Section 15 is the climax of the poem, and we get some special important thing. And it's actually really this sort of epiphany that comes to him. To the tally of my soul, loud and strong, kept up the gray-brown bird, with pure, deliberate notes spreading, filling the night, loud in the pines and cedars dim. Clear in the freshness, moist in the swamp perfume, and I with my comrades there in the night. Now, this is probably one of the most beautiful lines in the poem, and it's just... we can't overemphasize how important it is and how nice it is. So he's had this experience. He went into this descent, into this mystical state, into the collective state, and he got this information. And now this line is so beautiful. Well, my sight that was bound in my eyes unclosed. So what does that mean? My sight that was bound in my eyes. So what he's saying is, his normal way of looking at things, my sight, our perception of the world, which often becomes very rigid, very habituated. We all experience this. I do, you do. We sort of see the world in one way. We have sort of tunnel vision. When we think sort of politically or philosophically, in the media, people often talk about a sort of echo chamber of our political thoughts. Well, that's getting off a little bit from this, but my sight that was bound in my eyes. So he's suggesting that his way of seeing the world was very constricted and very narrow, and then that important last line, unclosed. So it opened up, and then what did he see? My sight that was bound in my eyes unclosed, as to long panoramas of visions. And I saw askant the armies. And so it's beautiful because there's almost kind of maybe a subtle wondering, like, why hasn't this been about the Civil War? This has been not only the most important thing of the last 5 years that's transpired for people reading this in 1865, but the most important thing that had happened to the country since the founding of the country. And maybe there's almost even like this subtle feeling of like, you haven't mentioned the Civil War here. And so it comes out in this sort of really powerful and dramatic way. So my sight that was bound in my eyes unclosed, as to long panoramas of visions, and I saw askant the armies. I saw as in noiseless dreams hundreds of battle flags, borne through the smoke of the battles, pierced with missiles, carried hither and yon through the smoke, and torn and bloody, and at last but a few shreds left on the staffs, and the staffs splintered and broken. I saw battle corpses, myriads of them, the white skeletons of young men. I saw them. So, there's almost maybe a little bit of foreshadowing here because, or there was foreshadowing earlier in the poem because when he first spoke about the coffin, early in the poem, he said that it was passing through the countryside, spotting the gray debris. And then he uses this word again here, and I think here, the debris and the debris of all the slain soldiers. Some of the battles, many of the battles, especially in the Eastern Theater, there are hundreds, thousands of dead afterwards, and people couldn't collect the bodies for days afterwards. Sometimes Whitman even wrote in, I think in Specimen Days, if I'm not mistaken, there was a soldier who described to him how he had laid half dead on the battlefield, and it took over a day, maybe even 2 days, for someone. He was a Union soldier, and actually a Confederate person who came later gave him something to drink, I think, and then later the Union soldiers got this guy and helped him. So anyway, so the debris and the debris. So all the slain soldiers that could be living, could be dead. I saw now. So here's the important thing that this is all building up to. We get this moment of drama, and then here's this sort of spiritual epiphany that Whitman has got. I saw they were not as was thought. They themselves were fully at rest. They suffered not. The living remained and suffered. So that's what we're getting out of this poem, and what Whitman is trying to bring to people is a sense that, first of all, the people who are dead, they're dead. Just in a frank, sort of logical way, they're not feeling anything anymore because they're dead. And so the living remain and suffered. And then it's so beautiful how he's actually, despite him, being so expansive and taking a long time to say what to write so often, here he's actually really concise and really beautiful. Who suffers? The mother, the wife, the child, the musing comrade suffered. The armies that remain suffered. So it's this moment that the speaker of the poem and the reader, we should have this revelation that we, especially the people in 1865 reading this poem, that they're suffering from having lived through this and from having lost so many people. And maybe that's the only way to sort of begin to get some closure. The dead are gone, they don't suffer, but you do, reader. He's saying you suffer. So that's the climax of the poem. It's the epiphany of the poem. And then section 16, really, it's just it's a way to sort of formally close out the poem. Let's go back one more moment here to this. So all that I've got here is it says section 15, the revelation. So that's just what we talked about for the last few minutes, that there's this revelation that's gone on there. So we'll just kind of quickly look at section 16. So again, I don't think there's anything that I have to really point out here. It's just a way of finding closure to the poem. He literally leaves this, let's call it a mystical state that he was in, where he received this information, passing the visions, passing the night, passing and loosing the hold of my comrade's hand. So you can see that he's walking away from all of this. He's got this new information. He leaves the song of the bird behind. Passing, I leave thee, lilac, with heart-shaped leaves. I leave thee there in the dooryard, blooming, returning with spring. I cease from my song from thee. So he's recognizing that his grief can, if not completely come to an end, at least he can sort of understand it and process the grief. And that's exactly what he says here in this, the first line of this last stanza. And yet each to keep and all retrievements out of the night. The song, the chant of the bird, the tallying chant, again, this correspondence or instruction aroused in my soul. The lustrous and drooping star with a countenance full of woe. The holders holding my hand, nearing the call of the bird. Comrades, my and I in the midst, and their memory ever to keep for the dead I love so well, for the sweetest, wisest soul of all my days and lands. This for his dear sake. So, in some ways, that third line from the bottom there actually answers the question that I posed to you as the graded journal entry at the end of section 12 was like, why hasn't he mentioned Lincoln? He never actually mentions Lincoln's name, but he, I guess in the best sense, that he's hoping that there's some sort of lesson to understand about this, and it's almost like he's dedicating this lesson to Lincoln, the wisest, sweetest soul of my days, for his sake. And lilac and star and bird twined with the chant of my soul, they're in the fragrant pines and the cedars dusk and dim. So, and I might kind of say that what we notice here is like there's almost like a return to what we saw earlier toward the very beginning of the poem, section 2, I think, when he describes the lilac for the first time, and there's this sense of it being this sort of beautiful, sort of homey farmhouse, and there's sort of a return to that now. So that can bring us easily to the end of this. So this is just a sort of a slight redefinition from one of the earliest slides of this from the previous video. So we could understand right from the beginning that the star was Abraham Lincoln, but what we might notice, as compared to when you first start reading the poem and you're in section 2, when he says, "O powerful western star, shades of night, O helpless soul of me, harsh surrounding cloud that will not free me." So the star there maybe just sounds exactly like Lincoln, but I think that by section 7, when he says, "Not for you, for one alone, blossoms to coffins all I bring," then we can sort of think about the star shifting its emphasis, not just from Lincoln, but anybody that died during the Civil War. The lilac is really consistent right at the beginning, right at the end. What is it? It's just it's life itself, especially the natural world. The natural world doesn't have grief and loss, etc., and so kind of a simple symbol there. And the thrush, which seemed maybe in section 4, the only thing we could say is that it was mysterious, and he said something about death's outlet song, something like that. That the thrush isn't just about death, it's about insight from death, or insight about death. So, here is the final significance of the poem overall. And so very simply, it's an elegy for Lincoln, and he travels with the coffin, back in section 5 and 6, through the country and the city. The suffering is what is sort of pulling him, especially in like section 8, when he says the western orb sailing the heaven. And there was that tension between feeling this suffering, but also feeling the call of the bird. And then all of those things that we looked at, these sort of possibilities at the beginning of section 14, ways to think of this. Those are just archetypal readings, if you will, archetypal explanations of what happened, a descent into his unconscious, a recognition about suffering, etc. So, great. Well, that brings us to the very last part, which is the graded journal entry. So, you might take a pause here, get yourself ready, come back to this video with your journal. And so part of the reason that I kind of really emphasize section 14, especially that third line, the large unconscious scenery of my land, and then my explanations for those 4 different things: the descent into the underworld, loss of the ego, darkening of the soul, value of self-questioning. All of those things, especially the loss of the ego, the dark night of the soul, have to do with the possibility, which I mentioned before, that maybe that there's some, I think it would be fair to say that in religions, there is frequently, if not always, an idea that suffering can teach us a lesson in some way. So that brings us to the end of this in the graded journal entry. So really simply, 10-minute stream of consciousness when you're ready. Whenever, this question, the implication of Lilacs isn't just about Lincoln or the Civil War. It's about suffering in general. Do you believe that suffering, as I suggested in here, as I suggested that the poem maybe is giving us the idea, suffering can have a beneficial component? So within the poem itself, it's the suffering that Lincoln's speaker, or that Whitman's speaker of the poem feels, which leads him into this insight. So this suffering brings him to something greater. And so the end of that, you just might, and the dark night of the soul, that's actually a fairly common phrase, obviously from the poem of St. John of the Cross, but it's come to mean anything, some difficult time that you experienced in your life. And so there's a possibility that that experiencing a dark night of the soul brings you to some greater understanding of your own life. So there you go, 10-minute stream of consciousness on that, and there will be more to come later. Great ending.